Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to get into a video today that is a little bit darker than normal. I talked about this a little bit in the video yesterday, but I have kind of a interesting moral dilemma that I'm curious what everybody thinks of it. I'm curious where everybody puts the line for morality or warfare or whatever. And so we're going to get into a video. This is by the Infographics channel, and it's worst war crimes committed by the US during World War II. And I'll specifically lay out my question as we get on later in the video. But I'm really interested in kind of what everybody thinks about this. So let's go ahead and get into it.
When one thinks of atrocities committed during the Second World War, the two most obvious culprits that immediately come to mind are Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. However, the Allied powers, including the United States, were just as culpable in violating international laws that they held their defeated foes in account to after the war. Though the Allies did not commit the atrocities on nearly the scale that the Axis powers did, they nonetheless committed actions that, if committed during any other conflict, would have severely tarnished the reputation of the fighting forces and surely brought about criminal charges. The main reason why so many of these crimes took decades to come to light is that even though in the few instances there were investigations, these were typically dropped or hidden away. This was done so as to not tarnish the reputation of the United States as they attempted to rebuild relations with their former foes. After all, if the international community had concrete and complete investigations of many of these incidents, it probably would have hurt the rebuilding process and made Americans look like hypocrites in the midst of high-profile war crime trials in Germany and Japan. But now that there's been almost 80 years for the wounds of World War II to heal, local communities in Germany and Japan have been taking a more critical eye of the picture-perfect image cast in the history books as Americans being the sinless liberators. Here are three.
Yeah, and I've talked about this in regards to World War I. Germany gets labeled in World War I in a way that I don't think is totally fair. I think a couple of things go into that. I think part of it is essentially Allied propaganda, right? Building up, this is not to say that there were not atrocities done, but building up, say, atrocities in Belgium to the furthest extent they possibly could be built up, right? I think another reason for this is World War II Nazi Germany, I feel like, kind of tarnishes and taints the way that we look at World War I Germany. And so when you study World War I, Germany gets labeled with a lot of things that, if every side was held to account in World War I for what they had done that was against the, ethics, laws, code of war, every belligerent would have been guilty of a handful of these things. It was not just Germany. Now, obviously, you're getting into a little bit more of a tricky situation with World War II because these then turn into atrocities on a level that are almost unfathomable, right? Like, I mean, they're so brutal and they're on such a large scale that it's really hard not to single those specific atrocities out. But I do think in World War I there's a lot more of this type of stuff.
3 examples of cases that often took 40 or more years to come to the public attention. Number 1. The Shinonia Massacre. The Battle of the Bulge was the costliest battle the US Army ever endured, and almost won Hitler a war-altering victory if it were not for the weather, bad luck, and tenacious defense of US troops. During the opening days of the invasion, US troops were taken aback and quickly fell back in the face of the German onslaught. However, after the first few days, US defenses started to stiffen and inflicted incredibly high casualties on the advancing Germans. As As a result of high casualties and seeing their last hope for a military victory dashed, German commanders were furious and wanted revenge. As a result, there were multiple massacres of captured American troops during the Battle of the Bulge, but the most famous was the Malmedy Massacre. The Malmedy Massacre occurred on December 17, 1944, and was the brutal execution of 84 defenseless American prisoners of war in a field. When U.S. troops recaptured the area and found the survivors, word quickly spread, and Americans from Eisenhower on down to the privates were outraged. Though top American officers never issued such orders, lower-ranking officers at the regimental level and below did in fact issue orders that no prisoners would be taken in the counteroffensive, though the official U.S. Army history of the battle recounts that though some units did in fact issue these orders, it was doubtful that they were ever carried out. However, one unit certainly did, and that unit was the 21st Armored Infantry Battalion of the 11th Armored Division. As part of their efforts to push the Germans out of Belgium, on New Year's Eve 1944, they along with another unit were tasked with clearing the village of Shinonia of Germans. However, the attack did not go so well for them. They were beaten back by stubborn German resistance and ferocious German artillery fire. The unit suffered heavy casualties and was forced to dig in to await further reinforcements at daylight. Early the next morning, on January 1, 1945, the attack resumed. Through sheer will, the Americans overcame the resistance, and that is when the massacre began. Though the Americans were certainly looking to kill members of the Waffen-SS, the Germans in the village were all regular army soldiers of a Panzer Grenadier division. Nevertheless, these were the first Germans they had taken prisoner since the new order, and several men in the unit elected to execute that order. According to men who witnessed the massacre, groups of 25 to 30 Germans were led away into the snow-covered fields and shot without warning. In total, it was estimated that 80 Germans were executed in this fashion. Once their deeds were done, the unit moved out the next day on its push toward Germany. Number 2, the Dachau.
Okay, so in this case, I can understand the reasoning, right? Like I can understand the reasoning of you come across an area that's been taken from the U.S. by Germans. When you retake the area, you essentially find that all of the American POWs have been massacred. I understand the thought process and the want for revenge. But if that's the way that warfare is to be conducted, then everything goes, because it will always be a back and forth, tit for tat, and so then there will be, I mean, literally then it'll get to a point where just anything goes. And so while I can understand it, I certainly don't agree with it.
Dachau executions. Without a doubt,
This is the one that I have the question about.
the scenes that greeted anyone who witnessed a recently liberated concentration camp must have been horrible. Decaying corpses, walking skeletons, the burning sensation of ash and fumes in the air, combined with the putrid smell of death, would have made even the most hardened soldier turn white. For troops of the battle-hardened 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division, the scene was more than enough to break the discipline forged during many months of brutal combat. On the morning of April 29, 1945, the unit was tasked with capturing the infamous Dachau concentration camp. Though not a death camp, it housed at the time approximately 40,000 half-dead prisoners and had been the final resting place of tens of thousands of people for over the past decade. The men expected fanatical resistance from the several hundred SS guards who would rather die than face inevitable punishment for their crimes in the last week of the war. After fighting through some light resistance, the men of the 3rd Battalion reached the camp by the late morning and were greeted with machine gun fire from some of the towers. After these guns were silenced, it seemed though the spirit of the German resistance in the camp was broken, and those not killed in the assault were eager to escape with their lives. However, for some of the guards, they would not do so, even after they surrendered. There are many different versions of the events that took place after the Germans had surrendered, which is probably due to the chaos and limited individual culpability. What is known as the most famous event of the massacre were the events surrounding the infamous coal yard picture. In this picture, a young American machine gunner was photographed shortly after shooting about 16 SS guards while they stood along a wall. Several of their comrades that survived the initial volley can be seen with their arms still raised in surrender. It was this photograph that helped expose the greater portion of the events that unfolded that day. The still unknown soldier is one of many who shot captured SS troopers that day. According to eyewitness testimony, one soldier shot 4 SS men as they cowered inside of a train car and then stepped into the car to give each man a finishing shot to the head to make sure they were dead. Another man allegedly shot several Germans as they came out of a guard tower with their hands raised in surrender. Still, what was more shocking were the reprisals brought by the the former inmates on their captors under the watchful eye of American soldiers. Seeking their revenge, camp survivors allegedly murdered dozens more SS guards by beating them to death with shovels and stomping them to death. The American troops understandably did not intervene, since they undoubtedly could not even imagine the horrors these survivors had gone through. Once news got out of the massacre, General Patton, who had become military governor of Bavaria, where the camp was located by this point, ordered an investigation. This investigation, which was not released publicly until 1991, detailed the flagrant violations of international law at the hands of U.S. troops. However, he decided not to press charges, as he did not see this as being helpful to the U.S. cause. Even today, it is safe to say that though the killings themselves were illegal, they got a much better death than what their victims did. Number 3.
Okay, so my question here is, in Dachau, the people that were killed there were guards, right? They were Germans that worked that and did everything that was done at Dachau, right? So in this case, should the U.S. soldiers who killed these German guards, should the U.S. soldiers have been charged with war crimes, right? And the next part of this is, if the answer is yes, should the prisoners who then turned on and started beating the guards to death, should they also be charged? Not maybe with war crimes, but with, say, murder, right? This is a very interesting one to me, because the line is extremely blurry, right? I think if you're an absolutist here, you would say, like, the U.S. soldiers should be charged not only for killing surrendered SS guards, but for not keeping control of the camp when the prisoners turned on the guards, right? But then also you would say the prisoners are at fault and should be charged for their retaliation against the guards. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly where I think this line is, because in my head, it's a lot easier for me to say the U.S. soldiers should be held accountable for what they did. It is much harder for me to say that the former prisoners should be held accountable for what they did. But there's really not much of a difference when looking at the two. As far as the action that was done, it's the same action. Like they're literally doing the same thing. I don't know. It's a very interesting moral dilemma in my head, and I'm very curious what everybody thinks about it.
No prisoner policy, April 1945. Not only did the Waffen-SS face indiscriminate execution in the final days of World War II, but so did the regular German army. After U.S. forces crossed the Rhine River in March of 1945, it was common that many units issued their own take-no-prisoner orders, as had been common in the aftermath of the Malmedy Massacre in 1944. However, the reason why many of these units issued such orders, or at the very least tolerated this kind of behavior, was due to multiple factors. The first one was the confirmed reports of concentration and death camp survivor testimony. These reports had slowly started to filter into the mainstream media, especially as the Red Army made its advances into Poland and Eastern Germany, where many of these camps were located. U.S. troops who had either seen the first-hand evidence or witnessed the footage were incensed at the atrocities and vowed to punish those responsible. Another contributing factor to the take-no-prisoner attitude in March and April of 1945 was the fact that, in the American point of view, the war was over, and those still fighting were the most guilty of war crimes, who were seeking to avoid punishment. Therefore, if they encountered any sort of resistance, especially in the face of their inevitable defeat, it was assumed that those resisting must be SS or guilty of some sort of crime who would rather just die in battle than face justice. Though many SS troopers and similar guilty parties did just that, there were in fact large numbers of regular German troops in the field who did resist only because of the lies fed to them by their government. It was this tenacious resistance in the waning weeks of World War II in Europe that would be their downfall. Atrocities committed by individuals were commonplace. Famed historian Stephen Ambrose claimed of the 1,000 veterans he interviewed, 1/3 said they saw executions take place. These countless murders were embodied in large-scale shootings in places like Jungholzhausen and Treseberg. During the battle for Jungholzhausen on April 15, 1945, the men of the 254th Infantry Regiment suffered heavy casualties. Though this was a combined action by the regular German army and the Waffen-SS, the army soldiers were eager to surrender, as reported by the local townspeople. However, it seems as though because of heavy casualties inflicted by the SS, the surrendering soldiers were treated just the same. In one of the most notable instances of the massacre, 13 German soldiers who had dug a trench behind a barn surrendered as soon as they saw the Americans. However, when the farmer's son went to check on them the morning after the battle, he found all 13 men were killed with a shot to the back of their neck while on their knees. Yet another villager witnessed an American soldier gun down 4 captured SS men when he told them to run away from him. Several other witnesses came forward that they were ordered to dig a mass grave for victims, which numbered around 30. In the town of Treseberg on April 19, 1945, a similar yet sadder story unfolded. Members of the 18th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division took very heavy casualties in the battle to take Treseberg, with around 60 Americans confirmed being killed, including a battalion commander, who the Americans claimed was shot by a sniper wearing civilian clothes. As a result, the Americans were incensed and wanted to take revenge. They found their opportunity when they stumbled upon a group of 10 Hitler Youth sent to the area. According to local historians, these young boys, all around the age of 14, had just graduated infantry training at a nearby camp and were
This is going to be brutal.
ordered to the front line. As they were making their way forward, they were surprised and captured by the Americans on the road. One of the boys managed to run away and hid, thus providing testimony for the villagers to reclaim the bodies of the boys after the American troops shot them. Soon after, the villagers had the boys buried with several German soldiers killed in action, and in 1951 had them exhumed to prove their murder, with the medical examiner confirming each boy had been shot in the back of the neck. These 3 crimes are just a highlight of the violations of international law committed by the U.S. forces during World War II. Unfortunately, the U.S. military was not very interested in investigating and much less prosecuting war crimes either during or after the war. In fact, most of the records and testimony actually come from sources outside the U.S., like the German Army War Crimes Bureau, that investigated reports of crimes against Germans by the Allies. Unfortunately, there are undoubtedly untold stories of more crimes committed by U.S. forces that may never see the light of day, but hopefully further scholarship in this area will set the record straight that not all Americans who served in World War II did so with honor.
Okay, so yeah, you hear and read stories from World War II, particularly they're common with people, soldiers, guys that were in the SS, right? I mean, that's the reality. There were and still are stories of SS groups that were absolutely not giving quarter when the Allies came across them. Now, in a lot of cases, obviously not in all, as this video shows, in a lot of cases, regular German soldiers would be treated kind of in the manner that you would treat POWs. But man, there are quite a few stories about SS members who were absolutely not. They were, in most cases, they were shot and executed. At least most of the cases that, have come out. But yeah, man, the Hitler Youth one too. That's I don't know. That's brutal. This is a rough video. Like I said, it's kind of dark. But I'm very curious what everybody thinks specifically about the Dachau one. Anybody that watches it, I would love to know where that line is for you. Does everything go? Or is everybody guilty and should be charged? Is there some line in the middle that you have? I'm just very curious about this. So But this was a kind of a hard video to get through. But I'm gonna put out another Sabaton song later, kind of try to lighten the mood a little bit. So like, comment, subscribe, help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the link to the Discord down below if you want to continue these conversations over there. And I'll see you all next time.